The air inside the Choi estate didn't just feel cold. It felt dead. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized silence you only find in places where secrets are buried in the floorboards. Tonight, the mansion was a tomb, sealed tight by black steel shutters that had hissed shut at midnight, cutting off the rolling fog of the New Jersey hills. Zara stood in the center of Juny-Young's master suite, her breath hitching in the back of her throat. For 3 years, she had known this room better than her own skin. She knew the scent of the expensive sandalwood floor wax, the medicinal tang of the saline drips, and the rhythmic, mechanical snick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that usually felt like a heartbeat, but tonight felt like a countdown. Her scrubs, a faded shade of discount blue, felt damp against her skin. The security situation, the head of security had barked about over the phone, wasn't just a threat anymore. It was in the house. She looked at Juny-Young. He was positioned in his wheelchair by the reinforced glass of the north window. In the dim glow of the emergency red lights, his silhouette was a masterpiece of stillness. His hands, pale and slender, rested on the armrests, like marble carvings. To the world, he was the silent emperor, a man whose brain had supposedly short-circuited 3 years ago, leaving behind a husk of a Mafia legend. Zara stepped toward him, her footsteps swallowed by the thick Persian rug. "Mr. Choi," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if you can hear the house screaming right now, but I need you to know, I'm not leaving you." Then, the silence didn't just break, it shattered. A sound like a lightning strike ripped through the floorboards from the level below. Crack. The distinctive, crystalline explosion of a reinforced window meeting a heavy-duty breaching charge. Zara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She smelled it, then the sharp, metallic bite of ozone followed by the acrid, sulfurous drift of gunpowder. It was a smell that didn't belong in a room filled with Korean poetry and silk curtains. "They're inside," she breathed. She lunged for the heavy oak door to throw the bolt, but before her fingers could touch the brass, the wood erupted. A volley of suppressed gunfire chewed through the doorframe, sending splinters of ancient oak flying like shrapnel. One grazed Zara's cheek, a hot needle of pain that left a trail of crimson. She fell back, gasping, her vision blurring. Through the jagged hole in the door, a shadow moved. A man tall, masked in tactical charcoal, the barrel of a submachine gun leading the way kicked the remains of the door off its hinges. The intruder didn't hesitate. He wasn't there to kidnap, he was there to erase. He leveled the weapon at the man in the wheelchair. Zara didn't think. She didn't calculate the physics of a bullet or the reality of her own mortality. She moved with the desperate clumsiness of a woman who had spent a lifetime being told she was too much, too large, too visible. She threw her body in front of Juny-Young's seated form, her arms outstretched, a human shield made of discount cotton and terrified courage. "No," she screamed. She closed her eyes, bracing for the impact, the sudden bloom of heat. The end of her story. She waited for the sound of the trigger pull. Instead, she felt a hand. It wasn't a ghostly touch, or the weak twitch of an invalid. It was a hand like a vice-thick, calloused, and surging with an impossible, terrifying strength. It clamped around Zara's waist, the fingers digging into her side through the fabric of her scrubs. With a guttural, primal grunt, the statue moved. Juny-Young didn't just move, he exploded into action. He surged upward from the wheelchair, his body uncoiling like a steel spring that had been compressed for 1,000 days. He hauled Zara downward, her feet leaving the floor as he threw her behind the heavy mahogany desk. The floorboards groaned under the sudden shift in weight. Zara hit the carpet hard, the air driven from her lungs, but her eyes stayed wide, locked on the man who was supposed to be a prisoner of his own nerves. Juny-Young Choi was standing. He didn't look like a sick man. He looked like a god of war carved from shadows. His suit jacket, perfectly tailored, draped over shoulders that were taut and ready. In his right hand, which had appeared from beneath the silk throw on his lap, was a sleek, matte black HK P7 pistol. The intruder's eyes widened behind his mask. The last thing he would ever see was the myth coming to life. Juny-Young didn't fire a volley. He fired a single, surgical shot. Pfft. The suppressed crack was followed by the wet thud of the intruder hitting the floor. A dark halo immediately blooming on the cream-colored rug. Silence returned, even heavier than before. Juny-Young stood over the corpse, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled lunges. He didn't look at the body. He slowly turned his head toward the desk where Zara lay trembling, her mind fracturing under the weight of what she had just witnessed. For 3 years, she had bathed this man. She had told him her deepest insecurities, her fears of being unloved, her secrets. She had treated him like a soul in need of a miracle. He looked down at her. The empty, vacant stare was gone. In its place were eyes of liquid flint, sharp, calculating, and devastatingly aware. He didn't say thank you. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply held her gaze, the gun still smoking in his hand, as the sounds of more boots began to thunder up the marble staircase. The man who hadn't spoken a word since 2023 was looking at her like she was the only thing left in a world on fire. In the world of the high-stakes underworld, they say the most dangerous man isn't the one with the loudest voice, but the one who has mastered the art of listening. For 3 years, Juny-Young Choi sat in that chair, a silent witness to the betrayals, the greed, and the heart of a woman who thought he was a ghost. But as the smoke clears in this room, we have to ask, was the paralysis a prison, or was it a weapon? And why? Of all the people in his life, did he choose this moment and this woman to break the silence? Before we reveal the web of lies that built this mansion, I need to know. If you were Zara, and the person you'd cared for in total silence suddenly stood up and killed a man in front of you, would you run for the door, or would you stay to hear the truth? Like this video, if you respect the code of silence, and drop your answer in the comments below. We're just getting started. To understand the ghost, you have to understand the man he was before the world stopped turning. The year was 2002. Northern New Jersey was a landscape of jagged contradictions. It was a world of black iron, the cold, industrial skeleton of the Elizabeth shipyards clashing against the nauseatingly green, secluded wealth of Alpine. In the early 2000s, the underworld was in a state of frantic evolution. The old Italian commission had been bloodied by RICO cases, and the vacuum was being filled by men who didn't care about tradition. They cared about logistics. Juny-Young Choi was the master of logistics. The rain in Elizabeth didn't fall. It drifted, a gray, oily mist that smelled of salt, diesel, and rust. On a Tuesday night in late November, 3 black Mercedes sedans sat idling near Pier 14. The engines hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the puddles on the cracked asphalt. Across from them stood the DeLuca crew, 4 men in heavy leather trench coats, their breaths blooming like white smoke in the freezing air. They were Old Jersey. They were loud, they were agitated, and they were holding a shipment of hijacked pharmaceuticals that belonged to Juny-Young. Where is he? The youngest DeLuca, a hothead named Vinny, spat. He adjusted his grip on a baseball bat, the wood scarred from use. We've been standing in this piss water for 20 minutes. Patience is a virtue, kid. His uncle, Sal, muttered, though his own eyes were darting nervously toward the shadows between the shipping containers. Then, the back door of the lead Mercedes opened. Juny-Young didn't step out with a flourish. He moved with a deliberate, surgical grace. He was 32 then, wearing a charcoal overcoat that cost more than Vinny's car. He didn't carry a weapon in his hand. He carried a silver cigarette case. He walked toward them, the click of his Italian leather heels echoing against the steel containers. He stopped exactly 6 feet away. He didn't look at the baseball bat. He didn't look at the 4 men. He looked at the crane towering above them. The tide is coming in, Juny-Young said. His voice wasn't a growl. It was a soft, melodic baritone that somehow cut through the wind better than a scream. Yeah? So what? Vinny stepped forward, chin tucked. We want an extra 10% for the insurance on this load, Choi. Things are getting expensive. Juny-Young finally shifted his gaze. He didn't move his head, just his eyes. They were cold, black pits that seemed to absorb the dim light of the pier. He looked at Vinny for 5 long seconds. The silence grew heavy, suffocating. The rain seemed to stop midair. Sal, the elder DeLuca, felt a bead of cold sweat roll down his spine. He knew that look. It was the look a butcher gives a side of beef before deciding where to make the first cut. Juny-Young didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a single gold coin, a custom marker used in his organization, and dropped it into the oil-slicked puddle at Vinny's feet. Keep the 10%, Juny-Young whispered. You'll need it for the funerals. He turned his back on them, a move of supreme terrifying confidence and walked back to his car. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Vinny surged forward, but Sal grabbed his arm with a grip like a trap. "Shut up, you idiot," Sal hissed, his face pale. "Look at the roof." Above them, on the edge of the shipping containers, the red dots of 4 laser sights appeared simultaneously on Vinny's chest. Juny-Young wasn't a brawler. He was a conductor. He didn't fight wars. He ended them before they started. By the time the Mercedes pulled away, the pharmaceuticals were being moved back to his trucks by men who appeared like shadows from the mist. That was the legend. The scalpel of the East Coast. A man who built an empire on the philosophy that if you have to raise your voice, you've already lost the room. Fast forward to the present, and the black iron has been replaced by the black iron hills of Alpine. This is where the winners of the underworld go to hide their blood money behind 18-foot gates and manicured hedges. The Choi estate was a monument to isolation. A sprawling, modernist fortress of glass and slate that sat on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the Hudson River. Inside, the air was filtered, chilled, and stripped of all personality. The floors were white marble, so polished they looked like frozen water. This was the world Zara entered every morning at 6:30 a.m. For Zara Okafor, the journey to the mansion was a daily descent from the real world into a high-end purgatory. Her morning began in a cramped studio apartment in Newark, where the radiator clanked like a dying engine, and the smell of fried plantains from the neighbor's kitchen was the only thing that felt warm. She would walk to the Port Authority terminal, a place that smelled of stale coffee, exhaust fumes, and the desperate sweat of thousands of people trying to get somewhere else. The terminal was a kaleidoscope of the invisible America. Plus-sized women in faded scrubs, immigrants with tired eyes holding plastic bags of laundry, men in security uniforms, the people who keep the city running but whom the city never bothers to look at. Zara was used to the gaze, or rather, the lack of it. When she walked down the street, people's eyes slid right over her. She was a big girl. She was a black nurse. In the societal shorthand of 2026, she was a service provider, not a person. She was the background noise of the American dream. Next, the bus driver would grunt, not even looking up as she swiped her pass. She would sit by the window, watching the landscape shift from the crumbling brick of the inner city to the lush, intimidating greenery of the Palisades. By the time she reached the Choi gates, she felt like she was stepping onto another planet. The mansion didn't welcome her. It tolerated her. The security team, men with thick necks and earpieces, never called her by her name. They called her the help, or nurse. They would wand her down with a metal detector, their hands clinical and cold, before buzzing her through the heavy iron doors. Walking into Juny-Young's suite was like walking into a vacuum. The silence there was different from the silence of the Elizabeth Pier. It wasn't a silence of anticipation. It was a silence of mourning. For 3 years, Zara had been the only source of warmth in that room. She brought the grit of the real world into the sterile world of the mansion. She would talk to him while she worked, her voice a soft, rhythmic comfort against the oppressive luxury. "It's raining again, Mr. Choi," she'd say as she adjusted the silk pillows, the kind of rain that makes the bus late and the floors slippery. "You aren't missing much out there today, just people rushing to places they don't want to be." She would position his wheelchair to face east, always east, toward the river, toward the rising sun he never seemed to see. She would look at his face, the same face that had terrified the DeLuca family, and she saw only a man who was as invisible as she was. He was trapped in a body that wouldn't move. She was trapped in a life that wouldn't grow. "I think we're a pair, you and I," she whispered one morning, her hand lingering on his shoulder as she adjusted his IV. "Both of us just sitting here, watching the world go by through the glass. At least you don't have to deal with the bus, right?" She laughed softly, a lonely sound that died quickly in the vast room. She didn't know that under the silk sheets, Juny-Young's toes had curled at the sound of her laughter. She didn't know that the scalpel was still sharp and that he was dissecting every word she said, storing them like precious gems. In the early 2000s, Juny-Young had been a force of nature. Now, he was a force of observation. He was watching the racial tensions of the staff, the way the Italian families were slowly encroaching on his New Jersey docks, and the way his own second-in-command, Mr. Kim, was beginning to dress a little too well and talk a little too loud. But mostly, he was watching Zara. He watched the way she hummed when she was tired. He watched the way her eyes softened when she read him poetry. He watched the way the world ignored her, and it made his blood boil with a protective rage he hadn't felt since his wife's heart had stopped beating. He was a man who had built an empire on knowing everyone's weakness. And he had just realized that Zara Okafor was becoming his. In the shadows of the Black Iron Hills, power isn't just about who has the guns, it's about who has the information. For 3 years, Juny-Young Choi played the ultimate game of invisible man. He let his enemies believe he was a vegetable, while he used his ears to map out their downfalls. But in the process of becoming a ghost, he found the only person who actually saw him, a woman the rest of the world chose to ignore. But as the political climate in the tri-state area began to boil over, and the old racial alliances started to fracture, Juny-Young realized his silence was about to become very, very expensive. This story is getting deep into the shadows. I have to ask, what time is it where you're watching this from? Let me know in the comments. And tell me, do you think it's possible to truly love someone you've never actually had a conversation with? The vacuum of power is a physical thing. It's a pressure in the ears, a thinning of the oxygen in the room. By the winter of the 3rd year of Juny-Young's silence, that vacuum had become a hurricane. At the center of the storm was Mr. Kim. If Juny-Young was a scalpel, Mr. Kim was a knockoff switchblade, shiny, aggressive, and prone to folding under the wrong kind of pressure. He had been Juny-Young's right hand for a decade. The man who handled the messy logistics of the Newark docks and the protection rackets in Fort Lee. But 3 years of serving a gilded vegetable had curdled his loyalty into a toxic, simmering resentment. Kim didn't just want the throne. He felt insulted that he hadn't been given it yet. To him, Juny-Young was no longer a man. He was an obstacle. He was a piece of high-maintenance furniture that required expensive nursing, specialized diets, and a security detail that cost more than a mid-sized narcotics operation. "Look at him," Kim would mutter to his underlings in the hallway, loud enough for the sound to drift into the suite. "We're paying for the best silk sheets in Jersey so a dead man can have a comfortable nap. While we're out there bleeding for every inch of territory, he's in here staring at the sun like a sunflower." Kim's psychological profile was one of desperate vanity. He had started wearing louder suits, electric blues, and pinstriped silvers and heavier gold watches. He was auditioning for a role he hadn't earned, and the weight of that insecurity made him cruel. Then there were the De Lucas. The Italian family from across the river had a memory like an elephant. They remembered the pier in Elizabeth. They remembered the gold coin dropped in the puddle. And they knew, with the predatory instinct of sharks smelling a wounded whale, that the Choi organization was leaderless. The confrontation didn't happen in a warehouse. It happened in the mansion's formal dining room, under a chandelier that cost $60,000 and cast a light as cold as a surgical theater. Zara was instructed to prepare the room. "The boss is hosting," Kim had said with a mocking sneer that morning. "He needs to be at the head of the table. Can't have our Italian friends thinking we've lost our manners, can we?" Zara had dressed Juny-Young with extra care that evening. She chose a charcoal gray suit and a crisp white shirt, skipping the tie to ensure he didn't look too constricted. As she wheeled him to the head of the long, mahogany table, she felt a wave of protective dread. "You don't have to do this, Mr. Choi," she whispered, her hands lingering on the leather of the wheelchair. "I can tell them you're having a bad day. I can tell them the doctor ordered rest." Juny-Young gave her nothing. His eyes were fixed on the far wall, his face a mask of porcelain indifference. But Zara noticed the slight tension in his neck, the way his carotid artery pulsed just a fraction faster than usual. He was ready. The De Luca brothers, Sal and the now-grown, scarred Vinny, arrived with the smell of expensive cologne and cheap intentions. They sat flanking Mr. Kim, who occupied the seat to Juny-Young's immediate right. The meal was a performance of dominance. Zara moved around the table, serving thick cuts of Wagyu steak and pouring a 1,995 Barolo that smelled of dark cherries and old secrets. She was the only woman in the room, the only black person. And to these men, she was as significant as the wallpaper. "The help is getting a little thick around the middle, isn't she, Kim?" Vinny De Luca remarked, not even looking at Zara as she leaned over to refill his water. "I thought you guys had standards in this house. This a nursing home or a gentleman's club?" Kim chuckled, a dry, oily sound. "She's efficient, Vinny, and she doesn't talk. We value silence in this house." as you can see." He gestured lazily with his fork toward Juny-Young. Sal DeLuca leaned forward, cutting into his steak with a silver knife. The screech of the blade against the china made Zara wince. "Let's talk about the Newark ports, Kim," Sal said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rumble. "My guys are seeing a lot of Choi trucks moving through the North Gate without paying the maintenance fee. We figured maybe the boss here forgot the arrangement. Or maybe he's just preoccupied." Sal looked directly at Juny-Young. He waved a hand in front of the silent man's face. Juny-Young didn't blink. "He's in there," Kim said, though he didn't believe it. "He's just observing." "Observing what?" "The back of his eyelids?" Vinny laughed, the sound echoing harshly off the marble floors. He reached out and flicked a piece of gristle from his plate toward Juny-Young's chest. It landed on the pristine white shirt, a greasy stain blooming instantly. Zara stepped forward instinctively, a napkin in her hand. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice steady, despite the roar of anger in her ears. "Get back, sweetheart," Vinny snapped, his eyes flashing. "The men are talking." Zara froze. She looked at Juny-Young. The stain was an insult, a flag of surrender. She saw Mr. Kim watching, a small, twisted smile on his face. This was what Kim wanted to see: the legend humiliated. To see the scalpel reduced to a tabletop for his rival's garbage. Kim decided to push it further. He picked up his glass of Barolo. "You know, Juny-Young," Kim said, leaning close to his boss's ear, his voice dripping with false intimacy. "I was thinking about that shipyard in '02. You were so precise then. So careful. It's a shame to see such a sharp mind go to waste." Kim tilted his hand. It was intentional, a slow, deliberate accident. The deep red wine spilled over the edge of the glass, splashing onto the mahogany table and soaking into Juny-Young's sleeve, right at the wrist. "Oops," Kim whispered. "My hand slipped. Nurse, be a doll and clean up the boss. We wouldn't want him looking like a drunk, would we?" Zara's blood turned to fire. She walked to the head of the table. As she reached for Juny-Young's arm to wipe away the wine, her fingers brushed his skin. It was a shock. He was burning hot. She looked up at his face. For a split second, a mere flash of a second, the mask broke. His jaw wasn't just clenched. The muscles were bulging like cords of wood. His eyes, though still fixed forward, were shimmering with a predatory, lethal focus. He wasn't just in there. He was a pressure cooker seconds away from exploding. Zara felt a shiver of pure, unadulterated terror. But more than that, she felt a fierce, protective loyalty. "I've got it," she said, her voice dropping an octave. She didn't just wipe the wine. She placed her hand firmly over Juny-Young's trembling wrist, anchoring him. She stood between him and Kim, her broad frame blocking the traitor's view. "The meeting is over," she said. The room went dead silent. Kim's smile vanished. "What did you say?" "I said the meeting is over," Zara repeated, looking Kim directly in the eyes. "Mr. Choi is tired. His blood pressure is spiking. If he has a stroke at this table, the FBI will be crawling up your driveway before the coffee is served." "Is that what you want, Mr. Kim?" She was lying, but she said it with the authority of a woman who had spent a decade in emergency rooms. She used the one thing these men feared more than a bullet. "The law." Kim hesitated. He looked at the DeLucas. Sal shrugged, clearly bored now that the humiliation was over. "She's right," Sal said, standing up and wiping his mouth. "The smell of disinfectant in here is ruining the wine anyway. We'll talk about the North Gate on Friday." Kim, with or without the statue's permission, as the men filed out of the room, their laughter trailing behind them like a bad smell, Zara didn't move. She kept her hand on Juny-Young's wrist until the heavy front doors clicked shut. She leaned down, her face inches from his. "I saw that," she whispered. "I saw you, Juny-Young. Don't let them do that to you. Don't let them make you small." In the silence of the dining room, the only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of a man who had spent 3 years pretending he didn't have a soul, and the soft, rhythmic heartbeat of the only person who knew he was lying. In the hierarchy of the streets, respect is the only currency that matters. And in that dining room, Mr. Kim didn't just spend his respect, he set fire to it. He thought he was showing the Italians that he was the new master of the house. But what he actually did was remind the silent emperor why he had built an empire in the first place. The cracks were no longer just in the organization. They were in the mask. And as Zara Okafor stood there, protecting a man who could kill everyone in the room with a single phone call, she realized the power dynamic had shifted. She wasn't just the help anymore. She was the only thing standing between Juny-Young and the abyss. As the story is getting long and dark, I have to ask, if you were in Zara's shoes, would you have stood up to a room full of mobsters to protect a man who can't even say thank you? Let me know in the comments. What time is it where you're watching this from? After the dinner with the DeLucas, the atmosphere in the Alpine mansion didn't just sour. It curdled. The air grew thick with a new kind of silence, not the peaceful quiet of a library, but the suffocating stillness of a forest right before a predator strikes. For Zara, the days began to bleed together into a blur of hyper-awareness. She was no longer just a caregiver, she was a detective in her own workplace. It started with the poetry. Juny-Young had a collection of first editions on a mahogany shelf in the corner of his suite, mostly Korean poets and a few Western classics. Zara dusted them every Tuesday morning. She was meticulous, moving left to right, ensuring the spines were flush with the edge of the shelf. But on a gray Thursday, she stopped. The volume of Pablo Neruda's 20 love poems and A Song of Despair was sitting 3 inches further back than the others. There was a faint, crescent-shaped indentation in the thin layer of dust on the shelf, a fingerprint. A thumbprint, actually. Large, masculine, and fresh. Zara's breath hitched. She looked at Juny-Young. He was in his usual spot, staring out at the Hudson, his face a masterpiece of blankness. "I'm losing it," she whispered to herself, her voice sounding small in the vast room. I'm tired. I'm seeing things because I want him to be alive so badly." She tried to push the thought away, but then came the smell. It was faint, clinging to the heavy velvet curtains, the ghost of an expensive, hand-rolled, clove cigarette. Juny-Young used to smoke them before the accident, but no one in the house smoked cloves now. Mr. Kim smoked cheap menthols that smelled like a burning pharmacy. The guards smoked Marlboros. Zara walked to the curtains, pulling the fabric to her nose. She inhaled deeply. It was unmistakable, the scent of sweet spice and charred tobacco. It was the smell of a man who was very much active, very much awake, and very much hiding in plain sight. As Zara moved through her routine, a darker shadow began to loom in her mind. Her own self-doubt. She spent her nights in her cramped Newark studio, staring at the ceiling, wondering if her mind was finally breaking under the weight of her isolation. Why would he move? She thought. If he could move, why would he let them humiliate him? Why would he let me see him like this? She looked at her reflection in the mirror, the soft curves of her face, the tired lines around her eyes, the body that the world told her was too much. A bitter thought took root. Maybe I'm just so desperate to be seen that I'm inventing a person to see me. I'm so lonely I've turned a paralyzed man into a secret admirer. It was a cruel psychological trick. In the early 2000s, the world was obsessed with the self-made man, but Zara was the self-erased woman. She had spent 30 years being the one who took care of everyone else, the one who didn't complain, the one who faded into the beige walls of hospital corridors. The idea that Juny-Young, a man of such lethal, concentrated power, would choose her, of all people, to be his witness, felt like a delusion. It felt like a symptom of a breakdown. "Get it together, Zara," she hissed at her reflection. "He's a patient. You're a nurse. That's all there is." But then came Friday evening, the night of the bath. This was the most intimate part of the routine, the part where the clinical met the human. Zara had drawn the water in the marble soaking tub, adding a few drops of eucalyptus oil to help with Juny-Young's circulation, or so she told the agency. In reality, she did it because she liked the way it made him smell like a forest instead of a pharmacy. She had moved him from the wheelchair to the hydraulic lift with practiced ease. She was strong, her arms were solid, her grip sure, but as she lowered him into the warm water, she felt a change. Usually, Juny-Young was a dead weight, limp, heavy, unresponsive. But tonight, as his skin hit the water, she felt his muscles ripple. It was a micro-movement, a subconscious flinch against the heat, but to her touch, it was like a lightning bolt. She began to wash him, her movements slow and respectful. She started with his shoulders, her hands gliding over the scarred, powerful terrain of his back. He had several old gunshot wounds, puckered silver stars that told the story of a violent youth. As her hands moved over his chest, she stopped. She could feel it. Under the wall of his ribs, his heart wasn't beating with the slow, steady rhythm of a man in a semi-vegetative state. It was thundering, a frantic, rhythmic thump-thump, thump-thump that she could feel through her palms. She looked up at his face. Juny-Young's jaw was a jagged line of granite. His eyes were closed, his lashes trembling with the sheer force of his will. He was fighting every instinct to reach out, to breathe, to shatter the charade. The steam from the bath rose around them, clinging to Zara's skin, making her scrubs translucent. She leaned in closer, her face inches from his ear. She could smell the eucalyptus, the soap, and the raw, electric scent of a man under extreme duress. "I know you're in there," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "I can feel your heart, Juny-Young. It's talking to me even when you won't." For a second, the world stood still. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of the faucet. Then, it happened. Juny-Young's right hand, submerged beneath the soapy water, moved. It didn't just twitch. His fingers spread wide and then clenched into a fist so tight his knuckles turned white beneath the surface. He wasn't just hiding. He was suffering. The effort of not touching her, of not responding to the only kindness he had known in a decade, was tearing him apart from the inside out. Zara's own heart leaped into her throat. She didn't pull away. Instead, she rested her hand over his heart, feeling the violence of its beat. "It's okay," she murmured, a single tear escaping and falling into the bathwater. "I'm a good secret keeper. I've been one my whole life." She finished the bath in a daze. The paranoia had been replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating certainty. She wasn't crazy. She was the most important person in the world to a man who could end a life with a whisper. As she wheeled him back into the bedroom, the house felt different. The security lockdown was looming. She saw the guards in the hallway whisper-talking, their eyes darting toward her with a new kind of suspicion. Mr. Kim was standing by the top of the stairs, checking his gold watch, his face etched with a frantic, nervous energy. He didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had placed a bet he couldn't afford to lose. The socio-political tension of 2026 Jersey was bleeding through the gates. There were reports on the news of the Italian families moving into the Newark docks, of police corruption probes reaching into the Choi organization's inner circle. The world was coming for this mansion. And Zara realized that the silent emperor wasn't just hiding from his enemies. He was waiting for the perfect moment to burn it all down. She tucked the silk sheets around him, her fingers brushing his jaw one last time. "Sleep well, Mr. Choi," she said, though she knew he wouldn't. "I'll be right next door. If anything happens, I'll hear you." She walked to the door, but before she turned off the light, she looked back. In the shadows, she could have sworn his eyes weren't fixed on the window anymore. They were fixed on her, deep, dark, and filled with a silent, desperate promise. Paranoia is a slow-acting poison. It starts with a fingerprint in the dust and ends with the realization that your entire reality is a lie. Zara Okafor spent 3 years believing she was the one taking care of a broken man. Now, she's realizing that the man isn't broken, the world is. And in a house filled with traitors, the only thing real is the heartbeat she felt under her palm. But the clock is ticking. The DeLucas are moving. Mr. Kim is desperate. And the silent emperor is about to find out that some secrets are too heavy to keep. Even for him, this story is stretching into the darkest hours of the night. What time is it where you are watching this from? Are you alone, or is someone listening in the shadows with you? Let me know in the comments below. We're moving into the betrayal next. The scent of the Alpine mansion was always lavender and expensive floor wax, but 10 miles away, in the rusted gut of Paterson, New Jersey, the world smelled of wet concrete and desperation. Mr. Kim didn't like Paterson. It was too raw, too honest about its decay. He stepped out of his obsidian black SUV, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the cracked pavement of a dead-end alleyway behind a decommissioned textile mill. He checked his watch, a gold Rolex that felt heavier than usual. Waiting for him in the shadows of a loading dock were 2 men. They weren't wearing the sharp suits of the Choi organization. They wore the nondescript work jackets of the DeLuca family's cleanup crew. "You're late, Kim," one of the men grunted. He was chewing on a toothpick, his eyes scanning the mouth of the alley. "I had to ensure the nurse was out of the wing," Kim snapped, smoothing his lapels. The lockdown is scheduled for midnight. The shutters will go down, the external feeds will loop, and the estate will be a vacuum. And the asset? Kim's face twisted into something ugly, a mix of fear and predatory glee. Juny-Young is a dead man who forgot to stop breathing. Tonight, we just correct the error. You enter through the service elevator I've unlocked. You go straight to the master suite. You make it look like a DeLuca hit loud, messy, Italian. I'll be pinned down in the security room, playing the hero who couldn't get there in time. What about the girl? The nurse? Kim hesitated. He thought of Zara the way she had looked at him in the dining room, her eyes filled with a terrifying, unearned authority. He thought of the way she protected the vegetable. She's a loose end, Kim said, his voice dropping to a cold, flat monotone. Liquidate her too. We'll say she was collateral damage, a tragic victim of the DeLuca's brutality. It'll give me the casus belli I need to wipe out the Italians and take the Newark docks for good. He handed over a digitized keycard. Midnight, not a second later. As Kim drove away, his heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He wasn't just killing a boss, he was killing a god. And deep down, in the part of his soul that still remembered the pier in Elizabeth, he was terrified that the god might wake up. The call hit Zara's phone at 11:47 p.m. She was sitting on the edge of her bed in Newark, clutching a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. Miss Okafor. The voice was clipped. It was the head of security, a man whose name she didn't even know. There has been a credible threat detected on the perimeter. We are initiating a Stage 4 lockdown. You are required at the estate immediately to monitor Mr. Choi's vitals during the transition. A car is 3 minutes away. Stage 4? Zara stood up, her pulse spiking. What does that mean? It means the house is a fortress, Miss Okafor. Get in the car. The ride back to Alpine was a blur of rain-streaked windows and high-speed turns. When they reached the gates, the atmosphere had shifted. The usual guards were gone, replaced by men Zara didn't recognize, men with tactical vests and submachine guns held at low ready. The mansion looked like a black monolith against the storm. As she stepped inside, the heavy steel shutters over the windows began to hiss shut, a mechanical sound that felt like teeth closing. Clack, clack, clack. The sound echoed through the marble halls. Zara was led upstairs, not to her station, but directly into Juny-Young's room. Stay here, the guard said, his eyes hidden behind tactical goggles. Don't open the door for anyone but Mr. Kim. The door clicked shut, and the heavy electronic bolt engaged. Thump. Zara was trapped. The room was bathed in the red glow of the emergency lights. Juny-Young was in his wheelchair, positioned by the now shuttered window. He looked like a shadow within a shadow. Zara leaned against the door, her chest heaving. They're going to do it, she whispered. The lockdown. It's not for protection, Juny-Young. It's for privacy. They're coming to kill you. She looked at him, desperate for a sign, a blink, a twitch, a breath, but he remained the silent emperor. Anger, raw and hot, finally broke through her fear. Are you really going to let them? She shouted, stepping toward him. After 3 years? After all the times I sat here and told you I felt invisible? Were you just laughing at me? Was I just your favorite TV show? She stormed over to the bookshelf, her hands shaking. She grabbed the Pablo Neruda book and flung it onto the desk. Then, she saw it. Tucked behind the mahogany paneling of the shelf was a small, leather-bound volume she had never seen before. She pulled it out. It was a journal. Zara sat in the chair across from him, the red light casting long, demonic shadows across the pages. The entries were in Korean, but as she flipped through, she saw dates, names, and photographs. She saw a photo of a woman with eyes like morning mist, holding a tiny infant wrapped in silk. She saw the same woman, months later, her face hollowed out by grief and sickness. She saw a hospital bill with a deceased stamp. Zara began to read the few English notations in the margins. May 14. They took the child. The life took the mother. I am the poison. August 22. Kim is buying more suits. He thinks I don't see the ledgers. He wants the throne, but he doesn't know the throne is a pyre. Then, she reached the final section. Her own name appeared. Zara. She looked at the man in the wheelchair. He was watching her. Not with the blank stare of a patient, but with the naked, agonizing vulnerability of a man being dissected alive. A single, crystalline tear rolled down his cheek, tracing a path through the red light. "You wrote about me," she breathed, her voice cracking. She didn't need a translator. She saw the dates. Every day she had hummed a song. Every day she had told him a story about her sister or her broken dreams. There was an entry. October 12. She sang the song about the river today. Her voice is the only thing that keeps the shadows from closing in. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to tell her she is the most visible thing in this house. December 5. She thinks she is not enough. The world is blind. I am staying in this cage so I can keep her safe. If I wake up, the war starts. If the war starts, she dies. I will stay a statue forever if it means she keeps breathing. Zara dropped the journal. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was screaming with 3 years of unspoken love and terrifying sacrifice. She walked to him, kneeling between his knees, her hands cupping his face. His skin was burning. "You stayed like this. For me?" she whispered. Juny-Young's eyes closed. His forehead leaned forward until it touched hers. He wasn't a mob boss in that moment. He was a man drowning in the dark, using her as his only anchor. He didn't speak. But the way his breath hitched, the way his shoulders finally slumped, was a confession more powerful than any words. "I'm sorry," he breathed. The voice was a ghost, a rasp of air that sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. "Don't be sorry," Zara said, her tears joining his. "Be ready." The moment of connection was shattered by a soft, electronic chirp from the hallway. Zara stood up, looking at the door. Through the small glass observation port, she saw the guards. They weren't looking out into the hallway to protect the room. They were turning their backs to the door, leveling their weapons at the elevators. They weren't there to stop an assassin. They were there to ensure that when the assassins arrived, nobody, not the nurse, and certainly not the boss, would get out alive. She saw Mr. Kim appear on the far end of the monitor, a gas mask slung over his shoulder. He wasn't looking for a threat. He was checking his watch, waiting for the DeLuca hit team to finish his dirty work. The mansion wasn't a fortress. It was an incinerator. "Juny-Young," Zara said, her voice turning cold and sharp. "They're here." The man in the wheelchair didn't hesitate anymore. The time for poetry was over. The scalpel was back. He reached under the seat of the wheelchair, his fingers finding the hidden catch he had installed 2 years ago during a maintenance check he had performed in the dead of night while the house slept. Click. The side panel of the chair dropped away, revealing the matte black grip of a suppressed firearm and 3 spare magazines. He looked at Zara. For the first time, he smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had already died once and had nothing left to fear. "Stay behind the desk, Zara," he said. His voice was gaining strength, the authority of the Black Iron Hills returning to him like a cloak. "And whatever you hear, do not look away. You are the only witness I have left." Outside, the elevator dinged. The betrayal was complete. The setup was perfect. But as the first flashbang bounced into the hallway, Mr. Kim was about to realize the one fatal flaw in his plan. You should never try to bury a man who knows how to walk through the dirt. The trap is sprung. The air is thick with the scent of ozone and the impending arrival of death. Mr. Kim thinks he has orchestrated the perfect crime, a tragedy blamed on the Italians, leaving him with the keys to the kingdom, but he forgot the one rule of the Choi organization. The emperor only stays silent as long as the silence serves him. And now, the silence is over. If you were in Zara's shoes, and your brother, or the person you trusted tried to kill you, would you let him live, or would you burn it all down to settle the score? Comment yes or no below. What time is it where you are watching this from? The flashbang didn't just explode, it erased the world. For Zara, the universe became a screaming white void. The pressure wave slammed into her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. This was the flashpoint, the moment the universe folded in on itself. As her vision began to return in jagged, flickering frames, she saw the room through a haze of gray smoke and swirling dust. The intruder from the cold open was there, the man in the charcoal tactical gear. He didn't move like a person. He moved like a glitch in the camera feed. He stepped over the threshold, his weapon raised, the barrel searching for the man in the chair. But the chair was empty. Zara felt that same vice-like grip from before, the hand around her waist, pulling her behind the heavy mahogany desk. She hit the floor, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world. She looked up, and there he was. Juny-Young Choi wasn't just standing. He was positioned in a low, predatory crouch. The charcoal overcoat he'd been draped in for years was gone, revealing the lean, corded muscle of a man who had been secretly training in the dead of night while the house slept. He raised the HKP-7. Pff, pff. The intruder's head snapped back. No Hollywood theatrics, no dramatic final words, just the wet, heavy thud of a body hitting the Persian rug and the smell of copper filling the air. "Stay down," Juny-Young said. His voice was a shock, a sound so raw and tectonic it felt like it was coming from the earth itself. It was the sound of grinding stones, of a mechanism that hadn't been oiled in 1,000 days. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Zara had ever heard. "Juny, you're speaking," she whispered, her voice lost in the ringing of her ears. "I never stopped," he replied, his eyes never leaving the door. "I just stopped talking to them." The room was no longer a sanctuary, it was a kill box. Juny-Young didn't wait for the next wave. He knew the layout of this house better than the architects. He grabbed Zara's hand, his palm was hot, calloused, and vibrantly alive, and led her toward the service corridor. As they stepped into the hallway, the emergency lights flickered and died. The world turned into a strobe light of muzzle flashes. 2 more men appeared at the end of the hall. These weren't DeLuca's men, they were Kim's personal security, the ones who had been feeding Zara's paranoia for weeks. "There he is. Juny-Young didn't give them the breath to finish. He moved with a brutal, economic efficiency. He used the wall as a pivot, swinging Zara behind the safety of a marble pillar. He fired 3 times. One man went down clutching his throat. The other retreated, his blood spraying across a $1 million oil painting on the wall. This wasn't a movie. It was gritty, desperate, and clumsy. Juny-Young stumbled once his legs, though muscled, were still fighting 3 years of simulated atrophy. He leaned heavily against the wall, his breath coming in ragged, painful gulps. "Go," he gasped, shoving a fresh magazine into his pistol. "The service stairs. There's a car. At the end of the woods. I'm not leaving without you," Zara shouted over the sound of a secondary explosion downstairs. Juny-Young turned to her. In the dim light, his face was a mask of sweat and blood. He reached out, his thumb catching the tear on her cheek. "Zara, listen to me," he said, the grinding stones of his voice softening just a fraction. "I am not a victim. I have been the FBI's ghost for 3 years. Every meeting in that dining room, every bribe, every murder discussed, it's all on a server in Quantico. I stayed in that chair to bury them. But I can't bury them if you're dead." The twist hit Zara harder than the flashbang. He hadn't just been hiding from his enemies, he had been the architect of their destruction. The paralyzed boss was the ultimate mole. "You're an informant?" she breathed. "I'm a man who wants to go home," he said. A shadow loomed at the end of the hall. It was Mr. Kim. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was holding a high-caliber revolver, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "You," Kim whispered, his voice cracking. "You were awake the whole time? You watched me? You let me spill that wine on you?" "I watched everything, Kim," Juny-Young said, stepping into the center of the hallway, shielding Zara with his own body. "I watched you steal from the widow's fund. I watched you sell out the North Gate. And I watched you look at Zara like she was nothing." Kim's hand shook. The power dynamic had flipped so violently he couldn't process it. "I'll kill you both. I'll tell them it was the Italians. You'll die in the dark, Kim, just like you lived." Kim screamed a high, pathetic sound and raised his gun. Juny-Young was faster, but he didn't fire. The heavy oak doors at the end of the wing were kicked open, not by more mobsters, but by a tactical team in FBI windbreakers. The ghost had called in his handlers. The hallway erupted in a cacophony of "police. Drop the weapon." Kim froze. He looked at the federal agents, then at the man who had been his vegetable for 3 years. He realized the game wasn't just over. It had been rigged from the first move. Kim dropped the revolver, his knees hitting the marble with a hollow thud. Juny-Young didn't lower his weapon immediately. He stood there, the scalpel of Alpine, looking down at the man who had tried to erase him. He looked like he wanted to pull the trigger. He looked like the monster the streets whispered about. Zara reached out. She didn't grab his arm. She simply rested her hand on his lower back, right where she used to support him when she moved him to his bed. Juny-Young, she said softly. It's over. You don't have to be him anymore. The tension in his shoulders shattered. He slowly lowered the pistol. The FBI agents swarmed the hallway, zip-tying Kim and the remaining guards. One agent, a gray-haired man in a suit, walked up to Juny-Young. He didn't offer a pair of handcuffs. He offered a hand. Good work, Ghost, the agent said. It's time to come in. Juny-Young didn't take the hand. He turned to Zara. He was shaking now. The adrenaline crash was hitting him like a physical blow. He looked small, human, and utterly exhausted. Zara, he whispered. She caught him as his knees finally gave out. She held him there on the cold marble floor, surrounded by federal agents and the wreckage of an empire. I see you, she whispered into his ear, her voice thick with relief. I've always seen you. In the movies, the hero walks away from the explosion without looking back. In reality, Juny-Young Choi could barely stand. The legend was a lie. The silent emperor was a mask. What was left was a man who had traded his throne for a chance at redemption and a nurse who had taught him that even in a world of monsters, there is such a thing as a sanctuary. The violence was fast, brutal, and permanent. But as the smoke begins to clear, the real question remains. When you spend 3 years as a ghost, how do you learn to be a man again? If you were in Zara's shoes, and the man you loved revealed he was a secret agent who'd put your life in danger to take down the mob, would you forgive him? Comment yes or no below. The silence that followed the gunfire was louder than the explosions. It was a thick, ringing void, heavy with the scent of spent powder, pulverized plaster, and the metallic tang of blood cooling on marble. The emergency red lights flickered one last time and then died, leaving the hallway bathed in the cold, blue-white glare of tactical flashlights. Juny-Young sat on the floor, his back against the mahogany desk that had served as their shield. His legs, those pillars of black iron that had carried him through the shipyards of his youth, were shaking uncontrollably. The 3 years of stillness weren't just a mental game. They were a physical debt. His muscles, long kept alive by Zara's diligent massages and stretching, were now screaming in rebellion against the sudden, violent exertion. Zara knelt beside him, her hands moving with the frantic precision of a trauma nurse. She didn't look at the bodies. She didn't look at the agents. She looked only at him. Stay with me, Juny-Young, she whispered, her hands pressing against his chest to steady his heaving lungs. Slow breaths. Look at me. But Juny-Young wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Mr. Kim. Kim was 20 feet away, pinned against the wall by 2 federal agents. His face was a mask of ruined ambition, his expensive electric blue suit torn and dusted with debris. He looked like a cornered rat, but even now, his eyes darted toward the fallen pistol on the floor. You think this changes anything? Kim wheezed, a spray of red dotting his lips. You're a rat, Choi. The commission, the DeLucas, they'll never stop. You'll be looking over your shoulder until the day they put you in a box for real. Juny-Young's eyes darkened. The scalpel returned to his gaze, that cold, lethal calculation that had built his empire. He reached out, his fingers brushing the matte black grip of the HK-P7 that lay just inches from his knee. The federal agents hesitated. They knew the ghost. They knew what he was capable of. They knew that in the world of the undercover asset, sometimes the lines of the law blurred into the shadows of the street. Juny-Young, the lead agent, Miller, warned softly, his hand hovering over his own holster. Don't. We have him. The evidence in that safe is enough to bury him for life. Don't throw away 3 years of silence for 10 seconds of vengeance. Juny-Young didn't seem to hear him. His hand closed around the gun. The weight of it felt familiar, comfortable, like an old friend returning after a long absence. He began to pull it toward him, his jaw set in a jagged line of iron. He tried to kill you, Juny-Young whispered, his voice still that tectonic rasp. He wasn't looking at Kim anymore. He was looking at the scratch on Zara's cheek, the one caused by the splinters of the door. He looked at you, like you were nothing. He started to raise the weapon. Juny-Young, stop. Zara's voice wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream. It was the same steady, warm tone she had used for 3 years to tell him about the weather and the bus in her dreams. She placed her hand over his, not the vice-like grip of a fighter, but the soft, anchoring touch of the woman who had cared for him when he was invisible. "If you do this," she said, her eyes searching his, "then Kim was right. Then the monster is all there is. And I didn't spend 3 years talking to a monster." Juny-Young's finger tightened on the trigger. The hammer clicked back. "I stayed in that chair so I could be a man again," he breathed, his voice breaking. "How can I be a man and let him live after what he did to you?" "Because you're more than what you do to your enemies," Zara replied, her thumb tracing the back of his hand. "You're what you do for the people you love. Look at me. Please, look at me." The standoff lasted an eternity in the span of 5 seconds. The agents held their breath. Kim squeezed his eyes shut. Slowly, agonizingly, Juny-Young's eyes shifted. He looked at Zara, really looked at her. He saw the smudge of soot on her forehead, the fierce light in her tired eyes, and the way her hand didn't tremble as it held his. He saw the future she represented. A world without shipyards, without gold markers, and without the suffocating weight of the silent emperor. The gun clattered to the marble floor. "Take him away," Juny-Young rasped, his head falling back against the desk. "Get him out of my house." As the agents dragged Kim toward the service elevator, the traitor didn't stop shouting. "You're soft, Choi. You're dead. You hear me? Dead." But Juny-Young didn't hear him. He had already collapsed. The adrenaline crash hit like a tidal wave. His nervous system, pushed to the brink of collapse, finally surrendered. His eyes rolled back, and his body went limp. Not the simulated limpness of the last 3 years, but the genuine, terrifying exhaustion of a man whose heart was finally slowing down. Zara caught him before his head hit the floor. "Medic!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the ruins of the wing. "I need a gurney and a cardiac monitor, now." For the first time in the history of the Choi estate, the roles were reversed in a lethal, visceral way. The nurse wasn't just the help. She was the commander of the room. She ignored the FBI agents as they moved through the hallway. She ignored the chaos of the mansion. She ripped open Juny-Young's shirt, her fingers finding the pulse in his neck. It was thready, fast, and skipping beats. "You are not dying tonight," she commanded, her face inches from his. "Do you hear me, Juny-Young? You spent 3 years waiting for the truth. You don't get to leave the second you find it." She began to perform the chest compressions she had practiced 1,000 times on plastic mannequins. But this time, the life under her hands was the only one that mattered. Each shove was a defiance of the mob, the betrayal, and the Black Iron Hills. As the paramedics rushed into the room with their equipment, Zara didn't move. She stayed there, a plus-sized black woman in discount scrubs, looming over the fallen king of the New Jersey underworld. She was the protector. She was the sanctuary. And in the cold, blue light of the aftermath, she was the only thing in the mansion that felt real. In the world of noir, the ending is rarely clean. It's written in the stains on the rug and the ringing in the ears. Juny-Young Choi had to choose between the man he was and the man he wanted to be. He chose to drop the gun, but in doing so, he dropped the only shield he had ever known. Now, as the sirens fade into the morning fog, the silent emperor is just a man again, fragile, broken, and utterly dependent on the woman who refused to let him disappear. But mercy has a price, and as Kim is led away, we have to wonder, is a clean soul worth more than a safe life? This is the ultimate moral crossroads. If you were in Juny-Young's shoes, and your brother, the man who tried to kill you and the person you love, was at your mercy, would you pull the trigger to ensure he never comes back? Or would you trust the system and the woman beside you? Comment vengeance or mercy below. The destruction of an empire doesn't always require a bomb. Sometimes, it only requires a signature. 3 weeks after the glass shattered in Alpine, the fallout began to rain down across the tri-state area. Juny-Young wasn't in a hospital bed anymore. Under the heavy guard of federal marshals, he had been moved to a black site, a nondescript safe house in the rural heart of Pennsylvania. But even from a distance, the silent emperor was finishing what he started. He didn't need to pull a trigger. He had something much more lethal than a bullet. The dead man's switch. For 3 years, every time Zara had been out of the room, Juny-Young had been working. He had used a modified, high-encryption laptop hidden within the electronics of his medicalized wheelchair, a device the FBI had helped him secure. He hadn't just been watching the sun. He had been mapping the digital arteries of the global underworld. He sat at a small wooden table, the morning sun hitting his face. He looked different now. The charcoal suits were gone, replaced by a simple gray sweater. The lethal sharpness was still in his eyes, but it was tempered by a strange, quiet peace. Agent Miller stood across from him, dropping a thick stack of folders onto the table. "It's done," Miller said, his voice weary but satisfied. "The grand jury saw the ledgers you pulled from the offshore accounts. We've frozen every asset tied to the DeLuca family and the Choi organization. By noon, 54 arrest warrants will be executed across 3 states. Juny-Young didn't smile. He simply nodded. "And Kim?" "Mr. Kim is singing like a bird to avoid the needle," Miller replied. "But your evidence is too clean. He's going to spend the rest of his life in ADX Florence. He won't even see the sun through a window, let alone the docks of Newark." The retribution was surgical. By using the legal system, Juny-Young had done something no mob war could ever achieve. He had delegitimized the life. He hadn't just killed his enemies. He had erased their legacy. He had turned their honorable blood money into federal evidence, stripping them of their homes, their cars, and their names. But the most profound change wasn't in the ledgers. It was in the woman sitting across the room. Zara Okafor was no longer wearing discount blue scrubs. She sat by the window of the safe house, wearing a soft wool coat, her hair styled in a way that made her look like the woman she had always been but never dared to show the world. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was the architect of a legend's survival. The agency she had worked for had been quietly dissolved after it was discovered they had been taking placement fees from the mob to put people in the Choi mansion. Zara didn't need the agency anyway. She was now under federal protection, but more than that, she had evolved. She had become the keeper of the most dangerous secret in the country. She was the only person who knew the man behind the ghost. She was the one who held the keys to his history, his trauma, and his future. "You're thinking about the mansion," Juny-Young said, his voice now a steady, quiet rasp. Zara turned from the window. "I'm thinking about the bus," she admitted with a small smile. "I'm thinking about how invisible I used to feel. And how, in that house, I felt like the only person who was actually alive." She walked over to him, her movements confident and graceful. She didn't look down when she spoke to him anymore. She looked him directly in the eye. As an equal. "You aren't a ghost anymore, Juny-Young," she said, resting her hand on his shoulder. "And I'm not the help?" "No," he whispered, reaching up to cover her hand with his. "You are the only truth I have left." The consequences of their 3 years in silence were permanent. Juny-Young would never be able to walk the streets of Jersey again. The name Choi was now a curse in the underworld, but as he looked at Zara, he realized that the systematic dismantling of his old life wasn't a punishment, it was a liberation. He had sent a message to the streets, to the Italians, and to the corrupt police. The silence wasn't weakness, it was a countdown. And now, the countdown was at 0. They say the best revenge is living well. But in the world of the Silent Emperor, the best revenge is making sure your enemies can't even remember why they hated you. Juny-Young Choi used the very laws he once broke to bury the men who tried to bury him. He didn't fire a shot, but he left no survivors. But as the feds pack up the files and the safe house becomes their only world, a new reality sets in. Zara Okafor is no longer the woman the world ignores. She is the woman who saved the most dangerous man in America. And together, they are about to find out what happens when the invisible finally becomes seen. Justice has been served, but at a high cost. If you were in Zara's shoes, would you stay in hiding with a man like Juny-Young, knowing you could never go back to your old life? Or would you take the federal payout and run? Comment, stay, or run below. 6 months after the sirens faded, the Choi estate was sold at a closed-door auction. The black iron gates were replaced by mahogany ones. The bullet-scarred oak doors were hauled away in a dumpster. A venture capitalist from Manhattan moved in, filling the halls with the sounds of children and golden retrievers. The sterile vacuum of the Silent Emperor was gone, scrubbed away by bleach and new money. In the dark corners of the Newark docks and the smoke-filled social clubs of Patterson, the name Juny-Young Choi transitioned from a curse to a myth. They say he was a ghost who possessed his own body. They say he was a genius who played the FBI and the Commission against each other until there was nothing left but a pile of folders and a dozen empty thrones. The underworld moved on, as it always does, but it moved more quietly. The era of the scalpel had ended, and in its place was a chilling realization. The man you think is powerless might just be the one holding the match. But this isn't a story about the mob. It's a story about the physics of the human soul. Juny-Young Choi spent 3 years hiding from a world that wanted him dead. Zara Okafor spent 30 years being hidden by a world that didn't think she was worth noticing. He chose his invisibility. Hers was a sentence handed down by a society obsessed with the shallow and the loud. The ultimate irony of the noir episodes is that the greatest act of rebellion wasn't the gunfight in the hallway or the dismantling of a billion-dollar empire. It was two invisible people finally looking at one another and saying, "I see you." Juny-Young found his salvation not in the federal protection program, but in the hands of a woman who didn't care about his gold markers or his legend. He found it in the nurse who talked to him when he was a statue. And Zara? Zara found her worth not in the eyes of the men who canceled dates, but in the heart of a man who would rather stay a prisoner in his own skin than live in a world where she wasn't safe. They were a pair of ghosts who realized that if they held hands, they became solid. The camera doesn't find them in New Jersey. It finds them thousands of miles away, on a stretch of coastline where the Atlantic is a deep, bruised purple and the sand is the color of crushed pearls. The air here doesn't smell of diesel or gunpowder. It smells of salt, wild jasmine, and the future. We see 2 sets of footprints in the wet sand. One set is deep and wide. Zara's steady, confident gait. Beside them is a second set, slightly narrower, the stride becoming more rhythmic and certain with every mile. They aren't running. They are walking toward the horizon, where the sun is just beginning to dip, turning the water into a sheet of liquid copper. Juny-Young stops. He looks at Zara, his face tanned by the sun, the jagged lines of the scalpel softened by the simple act of breathing free air. He says her name not as a prayer or a secret, but as a fact. Zara. She smiles, and for the first time in this narrative, there is no shadow in her eyes. "It's a beautiful evening, Juny-Young. Let's go inside." The camera begins to pull back, rising higher and higher. The 2 figures become small, then smaller, until they are just 2 dark specks against the vast, shimmering expanse of the coast. The footprints they left behind are already being kissed by the incoming tide. Soon, the sand will be smooth again. The world will have no record that they were ever there. And that is exactly how they want it. The ocean remains infinite, indifferent, and finally, quiet. They say that in the end, we all become stories. Some are written in blood on marble floors, and others are whispered in the dark to someone who refuses to leave. Juny-Young Choi and Zara Okafor chose the latter. They left the noise of the empire for the silence of the sea. Because the most powerful truth isn't found in a ledger or a confession. It's found in the moment you realize that being invisible to the world doesn't matter, as long as you are the entire world to one person. Where are you watching this from today? What is the weather like outside your window? If this story reminded you that you are seen and you are valued, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. For more untold stories of the noir episodes, subscribe now and hit the bell. Remember, the shadows only win if you stay in the dark alone. See you in the next episode.